Of the planetary influences that we've explored, I've saved Chiron for last, and that's because of its role in bringing all of the planets together. It acts as a bridge between the inner and outer solar systems. It links the reality-based inner planet and the visionary outer planets. Chiron orbits between Saturn and Uranus in a wildly elliptical path. That means it spends varying amounts of time in each sign. It goes through Libra in as little as 1.5 years, while it stays in Aries for 9. Since Chiron's discovery, it has made almost one complete revolution around the zodiac. That means we've had a chance to see it expressed in every sign. But before we talk about its meaning, let's go over the planetary body itself. On the 3rd of November, 1977, at an observatory in Pasadena, California, a man named Charles Cole found a 120-mile-long object. It was given the name Chiron and got asteroid number 2060. As the years passed, astronomers noticed that when Chiron neared the sun, it gave off a shine like a comet, and so it was labeled with a comet number 2. This was a decade when asteroids were being discovered by the thousands, but Chiron was the item that most resonated with astrologers, and a few began to study it with fervor. Chiron's identity only thickened as astronomers continued to bring in more information about outer space. A new area of the solar system was discovered, a donut-shaped region known as the Kuiper Belt. This belt is filled with millions of icy objects that are known as KBOs, or Kuiper Belt objects. These bodies are also called trans-Neptunian objects. This dark and frigid belt covers a lot of area, and so even our outermost planet, Pluto, sits in it. A handful of Kuiper Belt objects, of which Chiron is the most famous, were singled out by astrologers and were named centaurs. Thus, in astrology, Chiron is technically a centaur. However, you are safe in calling it an asteroid or a comet. This is the glyph for Chiron. It can be read in 2 different ways. Some say it's simply a K on top of an O, standing for object coal. Others see it as a key. This key has 2 teeth, one standing for Saturn and one for Uranus, the 2 planets between which Chiron orbits. I've always heard it called the key. But the key to what? The key to healing, to unleashing the freedom of higher consciousness. It's the key to unchaining the vitality of the sun. In Greco-Roman myth, Chiron was a centaur. His top half was man, his bottom half horse. But he didn't come to the world the way centaurs usually do. His beginnings were much more turbulent. You see, Chiron's mother was a water nymph named Philyra, one of the 3,000 daughters of the Titan Oceanus. She had a humanoid form and was exceptionally beautiful. One day, she was walking along the river's edge when the god Saturn glimpsed her from the clouds. Overcome by lust for the goddess, he began to pursue her. Wanting nothing to do with him, she began running as fast as she could. As he gained on her, Philyra turned herself into a mare so she could run faster. But Saturn turned himself into a stallion and overtook her. During this unfortunate non-consensual act, Chiron was conceived. After his birth, Philyra laid eyes on the newborn creature and screamed in horror, "Get this monster away from me." In her shame at the course of events, she went to Jupiter and asked if he could turn her into a tree so she would never have to go through such an ordeal again. Jupiter granted her request and turned her into a linden tree. So Chiron was unambiguously rejected by his mother, but soon after he was adopted by a foster father, the sun god Apollo. From Apollo, Chiron learned to shine as an expert archer, musician, a prophet, and a brilliant thinker. Chiron was known to be the wisest centaur in the world because he created the arts of astrology and new medical healing. In ancient paintings, we often see Chiron in the presence of a child. An association with children probably came from being raised by Apollo because the sun god was linked to the puer aeternus, or the eternal child, the child that remains a child forever. When Chiron was fully grown, he made his home in a cave at Mount Pelion in Thessaly. Here, Chiron earned a living tutoring the sons of the aristocrats who lived in the city. He taught them everything he knew, from archery and hunting to herbal medicine to a predisposition for healing. As the child of a god and a minor goddess, Chiron was immortal. So he had a great many students over a great many centuries. One of those students was the hero Hercules. Under Chiron's tutelage, Hercules learned how to slay a gorgon. Gorgons are frightening creatures with green skin and hair of living snakes. The most famous gorgon was Medusa, but there were others. And the scariest thing about this monster was that a direct look from her could turn anyone into stone. Slaying a gorgon was no small task, but with Chiron's guidance, Hercules was able to kill one and drain her blood. Now, her blood was the most dangerous toxin on Earth. Hercules brushed it on his arrowheads and dropped them in his quiver. Anyone struck by one of these would be left with an excruciatingly painful wound that wouldn't heal. It would not be long before one of these very arrowheads changed Chiron's destiny. But in truth, it wasn't the tip of the arrow alone. It was the tip of the arrow mixed with Chiron's identity problem. We know that when Chiron was a newborn, his mother abandoned him upon seeing his physical form. This rejection was Chiron's original wound. This wound was the result of nothing he did, mind you. He had no control over his parents, his conception, or the form he took in utero. This original rejection was not of his own earthly making. He had to deal with yet another circumstance beyond his control, and that was his body. Or to be more specific, the fact that his horse body was a mismatch to his shining intellect and his deeply empathic nature. This mismatch brought a lifelong inability to find a place where he belonged. Though Chiron looked like a centaur, he didn't fit into the centaur community. Centaurs were the Jerry Springer guests of the ancient world. They liked to fight and carouse and drink to excess. They were obnoxious, rude, and had general low-level consciousness. Chiron was, on the other hand, created by Saturn and a minor goddess, then raised by the god of the sun. These origins gave him not only special gifts, but a profound mind and refined personality. He was considered a trustworthy expert, but his horse body meant that he couldn't slip seamlessly into human culture. An intellectual human nature was sitting atop the half of him that was pure animal, pure instinct. His lower form was a constant reminder that he did not belong. He could not cast either half of himself aside either. In other words, there was no one else like him on earth, and thus Chiron suffered existential pain. Chiron's inability to choose an identity came into focus one day when Hercules and the heroes were enjoying themselves outdoors. The story goes that a rowdy group of intoxicated centaurs came along looking to rumble. Someone said the wrong thing, someone made the wrong gesture, and out came the clubs and the quivers. As the dust flew, Chiron stood aside watching the battle, feeling a deep sense of compassion for both sides. Suddenly, Hercules was hit in the arm. An arrow, covered with the blood of the Gorgon, flew off course and hit Chiron in the thigh. Over the din of the crowd, Chiron let out an otherworldly shriek. With tears streaming down his face, he limped back to his cave, where he fell to the floor and wept. In this story, Chiron has a wife named Chiron. She is a nymph like Chiron's mother, but unlike Chiron's mother, she doesn't see him as a monster. In fact, her role as a goddess is very receptive, and it seems that she has a thing for the wounded. She's associated with empty spaces where transformations can occur. She becomes Chiron's nursemaid. She uses tinctures, poultices, astringents, and cleansings, but they don't work. Chiron can dress his wound, but nothing she does can heal the wound. And even though Chiron is the most skilled healer in the ancient world, he cannot heal himself. Chiron howls in pain while the wound bleeds. This goes on for 900 years. Chiron comes to the realization that dressing a wound forever is not the way. He has to go as far as there is to go to heal this wound. He must rid himself of his immortality and let his body die. But Chiron needs help from a higher source. He beseeches Jupiter, king of the gods, to allow him to pass away. This unusual request can be granted, but now we have to weave in yet another story, a tale involving the god of fire, Prometheus. There was a time when human beings didn't know how to make fire. They were dependent upon occasional lightning bolts from Jupiter. Jupiter liked it that way, but Prometheus disagreed. So while Jupiter was asleep, Prometheus snuck up to Mount Olympus, took some fire, and gave it to the masses. Jupiter was so enraged by this act of disobedience that he condemned Prometheus to be chained to a rock forever. But that was only part of his punishment. The other part was that a griffin would peck out his liver each day. At night, the liver would grow back and the wound would heal, only to have the griffin peck it out again the next day. This was to be Prometheus's life for eternity. There was only one way for him to escape his fate, and that was by finding a replacement. Another immortal would have to be willing to switch places with Prometheus. He would have to agree to be placed in chains, have his liver pecked out, and die from that wound. Unlikely as it was that Prometheus would ever find a taker for that deal, now here was Chiron begging to switch places. Well, Jupiter allowed it. As Chiron was chained, Prometheus, the god of light and heat and fire, was set free. Chiron went through the pain of having his liver pecked out, and upon losing enough blood, the half-man, half-horse body died. In that death, his wound was finally resolved. Jupiter found honor in this entire story. He found courage in what Chiron had been willing to give away in order to heal himself. So Jupiter raised Chiron up into the night sky as a constellation. Some say that constellation is the one we call Centaurus. If we dig into this mythological story, it tells us how Chiron manifests when found in the birth chart. Firstly, Chiron indicates a place where you are deeply wounded. It's the most long-lasting, long-standing wound in your life. It's a place where the trouble is usually not made by you. It happens before you, sometimes before your conception. Perhaps the problem comes through your genes, your ancestors, or at the very least, quite early in life and beyond your control. You might have literally been rejected for something having to do with your physical body. You might have been called ugly and made to feel like a monster. In order to narrow down the original wound, we have to look at the sign and house placement of Chiron. We have to see where it sits and what aspects it makes. Its position will give us cues as to the nature of the original wound. The next thing we can count on is that the original wound results in self-rejection, and that rejection is of the instinctual self. Your instinctual nature is the part of you that's deeply tuned in to natural rhythms, to the flow of life, and to danger. Cutting off the instinctual self means cutting all that off. It means losing a big part of your nature. It means losing your ability to truly live life. Loss of the instinctual self is fertile ground for yet another, more problematic wound later on. Let's go back to the story for some confirmation on this. Being called a monster caused Chiron to reject his animal half. Thus, when the battle broke out between the heroes and the centaurs, he stood too close, wrapped up in human feelings and thoughts. Had he been in touch with his horse instincts, those legs might have taken him away from the danger, but he didn't listen. And so he stayed and got a very serious wound. Chiron is wounded in an area of his body that he can't see very well. He feels pain, but that's primarily how he knows something's wrong. It's the same with us when it comes to Chiron's wound. We tend to know we're hurt and that there's pain, but we don't quite know how much damage we've sustained. People don't understand how pervasive their wounding is. In fact, those who observe from the outside are likely to know more about it than the native does. People tend to think that they're doing well if they surround themselves with people who just don't make the wound worse. These people either agree to pretend that the wound isn't there, or they let you talk all you want about the arrow sticking out of your thigh. They may even change the dressing, but Chiron's wound can only be healed by one person, and that is you. You aren't just the wounded. You are healer of the wounded self. This brings us to another important point. Chiron is said to have a wound that won't heal, but that's not really true. Chiron does resolve his wound. He resolves it by asking for help from the outside and then giving up everything he has known, including the ability to live forever. He's ready to have his liver pecked out on top of the agony of the wound itself. He heals the wound when he dies for it, and this is how deep wounds are healed. In real life, it takes depth psychology and deep work on the psyche to heal Chiron's wound. Where we find Chiron in the chart, this kind of work needs to be done. You might ask why this work needs to be done. Why shouldn't we just suffer forever? We can. In short, self-actualization. Let's look at an extremely important detail in Chiron's story. When he's chained to that rock to die, Prometheus is released from chains. Prometheus symbolizes fire and light and enlightenment. So as the centaur's wound is healed in death, life itself is unleashed. This beautiful moment in the myth tells us that if we push healing to the very edge, not only is the deepest wound healed, the deepest kind of vitality is also set free. Carl Jung once said that nothing is ever healed, it's only released. This myth seems to say he was right. As Chiron's wound heals, not only do natives experience more vitality, they report feeling awash in a sense of belonging. As the instinctual nature returns, the conflicted centaur within finds wholeness again. We often see a lot of natural empathy expressing itself in the house where we have Chiron. We find a natural gift for healing as well. It isn't unusual for the native to be unaware of these things, the same way they're unaware of the depth of Chiron's wound or the lengths that are required to heal Chiron's wound. Depending upon the rest of the birth chart, some know their healing powers early, but most people wake up to their gifts during their Chiron return, which happens around the age of 50. That's also a time when people who are already in the healing arts may change their area of interest or their healing specialty. It's been suggested in astrological circles that Chiron's healing powers, his healing prowess, comes from the fact that he's wounded. But this story doesn't bear that out. Chiron was a great healer before he was struck in the thigh. Afterwards, there's no mention of any more students or any more medicine working or anything but him howling in pain. All healers are better healers when their wounds are healed over rather than hanging open. Now we've come to the end of the myth, where Jupiter turns Chiron into a constellation and places him in the nighttime sky. This interesting flourish says that the suffering that inspires healing also raises consciousness. It says that healing is permanent, like stars in the sky. Not only is it permanent, but it makes a pattern by which you and others can navigate the waters of life. There's one last thing to address. Not everyone is wounded. A great many of us are, but not all. Some people have almost picture-perfect lives. Not only does it look like that from the outside, these individuals will tell you that they really did luck out in life circumstances. It's always been smooth sailing. Well, Chiron doesn't forget anybody. For those with scant earthly wounds, Chiron's wound is likely to be existential. That means it's a wound that comes from the sheer act of being born. There's a psychic wounding to taking on a body and moving through the world. Our bodily senses tell us that we're alone now, separated from God and splintered off from others in different bodies. Existential wounds can bring extreme anguish in the right circumstances. But regardless of the kind of wound it is, psychic, spiritual, physical, emotional, Chiron asks us to do the same kind of over-the-edge healing work for our own actualization. Thank you for watching Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk. Stay tuned for all the ways you can get in touch for a birth chart reading and full astrological services. I'm Joy. More videos to come.